All right, so have you ever heard about this kid in Japan, like 7 years old, never even been outside Japan, and people are mistaking him for a returnee
Mm.
just because his English is so good?
It is pretty amazing, right? When you think about how much exposure they actually get in Japan to, native speakers and stuff, makes you wonder how they did it.
Yeah, and that is what we are going to be looking at today. One of you sent in this really, really detailed blog post by this dad in Japan. He kind of chronicles his whole at-home English adventure with his son, and it's pretty fascinating stuff. And, our mission today in this deep dive is to kind of pick it apart and figure out what we can learn from him, what were the core principles, and maybe, take some actionable insights for our own, at-home English journeys.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very long blog post, so we're going to try to kind of like get the most important information out of there and like try to figure out what were the things that really made a difference.
Yeah, so, right off the bat, this dad, he makes it very clear that this is not, a guaranteed formula for success. Obviously, every kid is different, every family is different. But it is interesting because it's like a really detailed, real-world case study of something that worked.
Exactly. It's not about like following his exact steps, but rather understanding the philosophy behind what he was doing
Yeah.
and why he was doing it.
Yeah. So let's set the stage. We're talking about a family in Japan. Both parents are Japanese. The son, obviously he had no experience living overseas. They were in Japan the whole time. And they started this when he was 5 years old. So what was the thing that kind of kicked this off?
Well, it looks like back in early 2020, they had just moved and, the whole COVID thing happened.
Oh, right.
So kindergarten was closed and they were stuck at home and, he couldn't really go out and play as much. And so, they basically decided they weren't going to watch TV, like Japanese TV.
Interesting. So that kind of created like a vacuum, right? Where they didn't have the usual stuff they were doing.
Yeah.
So what do they do?
So what they did was they decided to start like showing him English videos. And
Oh,
this is like a
neat.
really big turning point because, before that, he had basically never watched anything in English. And so they came up with this rule that
Yeah.
they were going to limit his, Japanese video watching to 30 minutes a day max. But English videos, he could watch as much as he wanted.
Wow.
Unlimited English videos.
Okay, so he's getting like bombarded with English.
Hmm.
What are the first signs that it's actually working?
Well, about a year into this, he was 6 years old and they were at a family restaurant.
Okay.
And, he says this thing, the dad calls it the "where is my folk" incident. You know what I mean? He says, like, "where's my folk," meaning fork, right? Like, he's obviously trying to say fork.
Right.
And, the mom is, like, surprised because he just used English, out of nowhere. And the dad is like, "oh, wow, like, okay, this is working." So that's, like, a really cool moment because it's, like, the first time he actually, like, used English, on his own without being prompted.
That's got to be encouraging for any parent, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
okay.
exactly. But, around the same time, they decided to, get him tested. They took him to J-Prep.
And, from the blog, I remember that it didn't go so well.
Yeah, he couldn't even read the alphabet.
Wow.
Like, he could speak a little bit, not perfectly, of course, but he couldn't read the alphabet. And actually, he left after like 5 minutes or something.
Really? So what did the dad do?
Well, I think that was a wake-up call for the dad because, he realized, okay, we're doing all this listening, which is great, but he needs to learn how to read too. So he started doing these like 15-minute sessions with him every morning and every evening where he would like teach him how to read, connect the sounds with the letters.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So like they were still doing the listening, but they were also adding this like more focused reading practice.
Okay, so like how much of a difference did that make?
Oh, it made a huge difference. A year later, they took him back to J-Prep. This time he was 7, and he tested at like the returnee level,
Wow.
which is like crazy. For people who don't know, the returnal level is basically for kids who have lived overseas. So they're saying he's like as good as a kid who's actually lived in an English-speaking country. And the dad was like, completely shocked. Like he could not believe it.
So from not being able to read the alphabet to like returning level like in a year, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it wasn't just that. Like in June of 2022, when he was 7, he passed the Eichen grade 4, and he got like really high scores in reading and listening.
Nice.
And then, in January 2023, he passed the Eichen grade 3 when he was 8. And he even got a perfect score in listening. And they decided, okay, no more Eichen after that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like he was really progressing really fast, considering he was in Japan the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, everywhere they went, all these after-school programs, he was always put in the return A level. And then he even did this, like, winter program at an international school, and they said he was one of the best English speakers there.
Wow. And this dad, he puts these videos on Twitter, right, of his son. What are those like?
Yeah, he puts all these videos of his son from like 6 years old to 8 years old. And you can actually see how much he progresses. Like at 6, it's mostly him just watching videos. But then by 7, he's like making simple sentences, talking about like Minecraft and stuff. And then by 8, he's like explaining how the internet works. He's talking about his Roblox creations using all these like really complicated words. And his pronunciation is even better than his dad's in some ways.
Wow, it's pretty amazing to see that kind of progress just at home, not in a classroom or anything.
Yeah, exactly.
So it seems like this dad, he has a very specific philosophy about how to do at-home English, right?
Yeah, and like one of the things that he keeps talking about is this difference between what he calls language experience and language explanation. And he really believes that you need to focus on the language experience, actually using the language, listening to it, speaking it, rather than just learning grammar rules and stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Like we learn our first language through experience. We don't sit down and study grammar when we're babies.
Exactly. And he thinks that, a lot of the English education in Japan is too focused on the explanation part, the grammar and all that. And he thinks that can actually make it harder to really learn the language.
Interesting. So he really believes in like the natural acquisition kind of approach. What about like the different skills, like, listening, speaking, reading, writing? Did he have an order he focused on?
Yeah, so he decided that in the beginning, they were going to focus on listening and speaking because that's, how we naturally learn language, right? We listen first, then we speak, and then later on, we learn to read and write. So reading and writing came later for his son.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So he wanted him to get comfortable with the sounds of the language, the rhythm, the intonation, all that, before they started focusing on the written part.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So he has these principles, right?
Yeah.
That he follows for at-home English.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that really stood out to you?
Well, one of the things is that he has this idea of like, what does it mean to know English, right?
Okay.
And he says, like, it's not just about passing tests or being able to translate. It's about being able to actually use the language in real life, like understanding a video without subtitles,
Right. Being able to, like, function in English, basically.
Exactly. And another thing is that he says there is no one right way to do at-home English.
Okay.
Like, what matters is finding things that your kid is interested in
Uh-huh.
and giving them consistent, high-quality input, whatever that looks like for your kid.
Yeah. So it's not about following some strict curriculum. It's about finding what works for your child, basically.
Yeah. And that kind of leads into another point, which is that he says you need to focus on the how, not just the what. Like you need to pay attention to how your kid is reacting to the things you're showing them, the videos, the books, the games, whatever, and be willing to experiment and change things up if they're not interested.
Right.
You have to make it fun, basically.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
Like if it's not fun, they're not going to want to do it. And he also talked about like this difference between knowledge and ability.
Right, yeah, yeah. He says, like, just knowing grammar rules or vocabulary doesn't mean you can actually speak the language.
Yeah.
Like, you need to actually practice using it.
Makes sense.
And, especially for English, which is so different from Japanese, you need a lot of practice, like a lot of time actually speaking and listening to the language. He calls it meaning exchange, like actually communicating in English. And he also emphasizes pronunciation a lot.
Okay, so this is interesting, right? Because we see how well it worked for this guy's son. But do you think other people can do this? Like, can we replicate these results?
Well, he seems to think so. He says that kids' brains are really good at learning languages.
Okay.
So if you create the right environment, it should be possible. The key is to, like, make it feel like they're surrounded by English,
Yeah.
and to give them opportunities to actually use the language for something meaningful.
And what are the things that people should focus on if they want to try this?
He says there are two main things. You need to create an English sound environment in the home.
Okay.
Like have English playing all the time, basically.
Yeah.
And you need to give them chances to use English in real life.
So like talk to them in English, right?
Yeah, exactly. But, and this is important, he says you have to make it feel like it's not studying.
Gotcha.
Like it has to be fun and engaging or else they're going to lose interest. And he says the best way to do that is to let the kid choose what they want to watch and read and play.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and he says, like, the parents should focus on whether the kid is enjoying themselves, not just on the results, Like, if they're happy and engaged, the results will come in naturally.
Okay, so let's talk about like the practical stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He mentions that his son was watching like 7 to 10 hours of videos a day.
Yeah.
That's a lot of screen time.
It is.
Like, how did they manage that?
Well, he says that they basically had English videos playing pretty much all the time,
Why?
like on the TV, on the iPad, later on even on the computer.
Okay.
They had a TV with a Fire Stick and an LG TV, and they even got YouTube Premium so there wouldn't be any Japanese ads.
Right, right. They wanted to keep it all English.
Exact.
What about other resources?
They used Epic and Scribd for ebooks, and they also went to the library a lot. There was a surprisingly good selection of English books there.
That's interesting. And, you think about it, libraries are like a great resource for this.
Yeah, and they actually thought about using, programs like Beness Worldwide Kids.
Right.
But they decided against it because they thought the quality wasn't that good, and their son wasn't really interested in it.
So they really focused on what he enjoyed, right?
Yeah.
So this is all really interesting, but like, why do you think it works so well for them? Like, what were the key factors?
Well, obviously the volume of input was huge. I mean, 10 hours a day, that's a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
And COVID probably played a role, because he couldn't go out as much, so he had more time for this. And, he was also just naturally an indoor kid, so he was happy to spend time watching videos and stuff. And, he was young, so his brain was really good at learning languages, and the dad's English was good enough that he could kind of guide the process.
Okay.
And I think the most important thing was that they didn't make it feel like studying.
Right.
It was all about fun and enjoyment, and that's really important.
I bet. I mean, we've all been there, right? When you try to force something and it just doesn't work. Now, he also talked about some mistakes he made, right?
Yeah, he was really honest about the things that didn't work. Like, he tried doing vocabulary quizzes with his son,
Okay.
but he realized he was actually doing it wrong.
How so?
Well, he was showing him an English word and then giving him multiple choice options, but the options were pictures that represented the Japanese word.
Gotcha.
So, instead of connecting the English word to the meaning, he was actually connecting it to the Japanese word.
Oh, I see.
So he stopped doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it shows that, you have to be flexible. You have to pay attention to what's actually working and what's not.
Definitely. So what about speaking, right? Like, how do they work on speaking?
Well, the dad didn't really actively teach speaking at first.
Okay.
He was more focused on the listening, but he did do things to connect the letters and sounds,
Okay, like what?
like teaching him the alphabet, reading English books together,
Yeah.
Picture books, even some manga.
Manga in English.
Yeah, why not?
That's cool.
And they would sing English songs together. And he had these 15-minute sessions with him, every morning and every evening.
So that's where he was doing like more structured stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And then later on, once he was better at reading, they started putting the language settings on his video games in English.
That's smart.
Yeah, so that he would have to read more. And what's interesting is that the dad talks about some of the struggles they had with reading.
Okay.
Like, his son would sometimes skip words or substitute Japanese words when he was reading.
I've seen that.
Yeah, it's pretty common. But, instead of getting mad, he would just patiently correct him and explain the new words.
That takes patience.
It does. And he realized that it was just part of the process,
Yeah.
his son's brain was still figuring out how to read in English.
Yeah. It's really interesting to hear like the dad's perspective on all of this. What about his wife? Like, what did she think about all this English stuff?
Well, in the beginning, she was a little skeptical.
I can imagine.
It seemed like he was just watching a lot of TV.
Right.
But as she saw him getting better, she started to trust her husband more.
Okay.
And it's funny because, the dad says that he would always call it an experiment when he talked to his wife about it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think it was a way to kind of, make it seem less scary. Like, oh, we're just trying something new.
Yeah. And maybe like manage expectations a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
It's funny, like how you frame things
Right.
can make a big difference.
Totally.
And he also was very careful about like the words he used when he talked to his son about English, right?
Yeah, he never said English study.
Oh,
He
right.
would say things like English training or English practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wanted to make it seem more like, a skill that you develop, like playing a sport or an instrument.
Yeah, not like a school subject.
Exactly. And he was
Mhm.
always trying to make it fun, to take the pressure off. And they actually did put him in an English class eventually.
Mm.
Yeah. But it was just a one-on-one conversation class.
Yeah, like a tutor.
Yeah. But the dad specifically asked the teacher to just talk to him in English about things he was interested in.
Okay, so like no textbooks or anything?
No, just conversation. And he says that this teacher really helped his son to enjoy speaking English.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about making it a positive experience.
Definitely. Now, what about Japanese, right? Like, they're focusing so much on English. Did they worry about his Japanese?
Well, in the beginning, he was used to watching Japanese videos, so he wasn't that happy about switching to English.
I bet.
But eventually, he found things he liked in English, so it wasn't a problem. And the dad says it's important to let the kids choose what they want to watch.
Right.
But as for Japanese, the dad admits that, maybe his son's Japanese is a little bit behind because they're focusing so much on English.
Makes sense.
But he says that was a conscious decision they made, because they believe that English is really important for his future. But, to make sure his Japanese doesn't suffer too much, they're very careful about how they communicate at home. Like, they make him use complete sentences when he speaks Japanese. Not just like single words or phrases.
Okay.
Yeah, they want him to be able to express himself clearly and precisely in both languages.
It's interesting, right? Like, how they're using this to improve his Japanese, too, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's all connected.
So let's talk about the parents, right? Like, their own English level. It seems like the dad was pretty good at English.
Yeah, he had never lived overseas, but he had used English for work. And his Teoiei score in his 30s was 768.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. But when he was like 40, he decided to really improve his English. He got his Teoiei up to 915. He passed the Aiken pre-first grade. And he even did a short study abroad in the Philippines.
Wow.
Yeah. And he says his main focus was on listening.
And he could understand what his son was watching.
Yeah, which is really important. I mean, if you don't understand it yourself, how can you guide your kid?
Definitely. And it's funny because he says now his son's English is actually better than his.
Yeah, that's amazing.
What about the mom? What was her English like?
Her English was like pretty basic, just what she learned in school.
Right.
She didn't really use it much in her daily life, so she couldn't really understand what her son was saying most of the time.
I see.
And the dad said that, sometimes he would have to explain things to her or even have his son explain things to her in Japanese, which is kind of funny, right? Like the kid is teaching the parent.
Yeah, that's awesome. So they started all this when he was 5. Why do you think they chose that age?
Well, the dad says that, by that age, his son's Japanese was already pretty good.
Okay.
And he thought that, if they needed to focus more on English later, they could.
Right.
And, he admits that they weren't really sure what they were doing at first.
Like they were just experimenting.
Yeah, exactly.
But now, looking back, what does he think is the best age to start?
He thinks that starting around 4 or 5 is probably ideal.
Okay.
Because, by then they have a good foundation in their native language, but they still have a lot of free time.
Right. Before they start elementary school.
Yeah, exactly. Because once they're in elementary school, they have less free time, and they might not be as open to their parents' suggestions.
Yeah, they want to do their own thing.
Yeah. And the dad also said that, comparing his own experience learning English as an adult to his son's experience, it's clear that kids learn languages way faster.
I think that's pretty obvious to anyone who's tried to learn a language as an adult, right?
Yeah.
It's just so much harder. So, one last thing. What about academics? Like, were they doing this to prepare him for school or anything?
Well, the dad says that, no, they're not planning on him taking any junior high school entrance exams.
Really?
Yeah, which is pretty unusual in Japan. And he says that they're not really focused on academics in general.
Interesting.
Yeah, he says they're more like, unconventional parents.
I see.
They just want their son to be happy and to enjoy learning. So, to wrap things up, we've gone through a lot of information here. What are the big takeaways, do you think? Like, what should people remember from this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that immersion is really powerful. Like, if you can create an environment where your kid is constantly exposed to English, they will learn it.
Okay.
And it's important to focus on the experience, not just the explanation.
Right.
Like, don't worry too much about grammar rules and stuff in the beginning. Just let them experience the language and find things that they're interested in.
Right. Make it fun.
Exactly. And, remember that this is just one family's story.
Yeah. What worked for them might not work for everyone.
Yeah, so you have to be flexible and adapt it to your own situation.
So here's a question for you, the
Yeah.
listener.
Okay.
This kid, he watched thousands of hours of English videos.
Yeah.
But do you think that's the most important thing? Or is it more about the environment and the kid's own motivation?
That's a really good question. Like, what are the things that really make a difference in language learning?
Yeah. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks for sending in this blog post. It was really interesting to go through it.
Yeah, it was a great deep dive.
Thanks for listening, everyone.